Welcome to AI Founders Mindset. This podcast dives into the stories of visionary founders and incredible people who power the startup ecosystem. Whether you are building your own startups or simply curious about the world of startups, you are in the right place. Today's episode, the conversation with Neal, the director at TechStars San Francisco, and George, the founder CEO at Noetic. We talked about the difference between TechStars SF and Tokyo, others programs, and how can we find the programs for us, and about the founder's mindset. If you like this episode, please subscribe our channel and also give your like. Thank you so much. So speaking of compared to other organization, so you guys knew TechStars San Francisco and also TechStars Tokyo, right?
TechStars Tokyo and San Francisco both started at the same time. Hey Yuki. Yuki's the MD of Tokyo. Shout out to Yuki. He's awesome. And so I just went to their demo day. I was renewing my visa. That's a different story. So I went over there at the same time. I was lucky to be able to attend that. And yeah, it's a very different model. You know, it's near Mitsukoshimae. It's very, very sort of fancy and yeah, like it's in the area.
Kind of like Chuo city, kind of a historical building and modern building.
Yeah, a very wealthy sort of area. Like it's a very different vibe and very, suited up and professional. And this is
I'm over here unprofessional.
Yeah, no,
guys. Not professional.
And this is a non-suited up, very professional vibe over here. There's 500 attendees. I think we'll be 150. Something like that.
Who knows?
So we don't know at this point, but it's
they're
next week.
Spirit.
So yeah, they're in spirit. And we're just different flavor. And again, the more we can collaborate with one another and cross over, and the format that this man sort of pioneered within TechStars, I think as well, could be great over there. So we have a lot to learn from each other. It was all those startups were incredible. Some of them I was really so surprised, and I'm definitely made friends with a couple of people there, and I can't wait to go, learn from them as well. So it's all a virtuous cycle. It's an incredible network. So, yeah.
And I also had the pleasure to serve on the screening committee for the TechStars.
What is this?
The screening committee is the evaluation period for the companies to invest in for the TechStars Tokyo program. So I participated on that, and I'm huge fans of that new program, all of our TechStars programs. So each program that we have, almost 30 all over the world, 30. And they're all different because each managing director and each team has a different set of expertise and skills. There's different mentors, there's different culture, and there's different companies within those regions of where those programs operate. So you're drawing from so many diverse perspectives, and every now and then we have cross-pollination where George will go visit the Tokyo demo day and interact with people there, or I'll go visit, some other program in LA or in New York and see those managing directors or founders and find ways to help them. So lots of collaboration across programs, even though they're all different, just like we're all different.
Yeah. I love that. So one of amazing fact, key takeaway from our conversation today is, so TechStars is a strong brand which has 30 locations, and then so each TechStars has different teachers, different senseis, different program. I see. So as a kind of a potential founder who want to join accelerator, we could ask people or research and then can choose which city, correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. So on the techstars.com website, you can choose from all these different programs that are all over, and some have a focus, like a theme, which might be relevant to your business. Others have a more general thesis. So my San Francisco program, we do invest in AI and deep tech and B2B and enterprise SaaS companies, but far more than that. That's just the beginning. So I have a very broad set of businesses that I can work with and invest in. But I'm curious from George, because given your kind of business as well as the other companies in your program, like in this program, I'm curious to know how you see the thematic focus relative to what these businesses are focused on and how that plays into your accelerator experience.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, really? Okay. Well, I would say, first of all, TechStars in general, to me, it's a network, it's a mindset, and it's a philosophy of give first. That's sort of like my thesis of TechStars. But this specific cohort, what is it that unifies the 12 of us? That's, well, I think the one thing we have in common most, and this might sound a little kumbaya, but it's sort of a personality trait. Everyone's very, perhaps it could be, everyone's someone that Neal could be friends with. He's the center of that, I think. I think he chose everyone he could be friends with. Everyone's very giving, patient. Yeah, I think everyone has very genuine intentions to be of value and to be of help to the world. Yeah, I wouldn't say is there a unified? We're not all doing AI. We're not all. Some of us are in health tech. Some of us are, some of us are ed tech. I'm B2B research SaaS.
Games.
Yeah, gaming, of course. Yeah, this man's a gamer. Kojima-san, good to see you. Yeah, so I mean, Neal, what do you think? What is it that really unifies us? I can't answer that. Other than that,
no, I think you gave a great answer. I think that's exactly right. For anyone out there who invests or wants to be an investor or is actively investing, I'm sure can relate. You not only want to invest in ideas that you think are great, but you also want to invest in great people, right?
Yeah,
so
sincerity.
it's the first step, because at the end of the day, you could start to build a successful business, but it won't really go the distance unless it has the right leadership who both lead and manage in ways that allow a lot of other people to join them and want to continue working very, very, in a very committed way, in an alignment with a vision that's huge. So people is everything, because the business itself will change a lot.
Yeah.
What it's doing, what its product is, the customers it serves, as it scales, all of those things will evolve significantly. So the one thing that's true at the end of the day is that there's some people who are a part of that business that need to help steer it as it modifies its path and trajectory. So people is everything at this point.
People's everything. It's amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. So almost all last question, Neal and George. So tell us about your next milestone in next 1 year for your private and also career.
Personal, professional.
Yeah.
Personal. Okay, oh, me first, really? Okay. Well, okay. So I'm moving back to Tokyo in February. And my aim is to, along with this man's help, I'm going to focus on providing value, generating revenue. I'll raise a round over here. I also have my investor in Tokyo, Deepcore, hey, Nemoto-san, Hiroshi, that will follow on as well. So I'm really looking forward to really settling in and applying all these learnings. Everything I've learned here, I've not really had time to go back over it all and to really absorb everything. It's been just so intense, and it's been so much fun every day. Every moment of every day I've been happy, even when I'm exhausted. So it's been an incredible experience. And again, like somehow, in some small way, helping the Japanese startup ecosystem. There are so many people there, and I've seen it grow since 2020 with Deepcore, there's Shibuya, and then from Shibuya there's Miho Tanaka. She's gone to Sapporo now, helping with Sapporo startup support. She was the first person to really help me out. Thank you, Miho. And now Station AI as well in Aichiken, Nagoya, along with SoftBank. They've just launched a huge campus. I haven't been yet. I can't wait to go.
This year?
Yeah, just this month. I think it was 1st of November. It's a great initiative. So there are things happening big time. Japan's really on the up. And even some examples like Sakana AI, and then there's, so they are, forgive me guys if you see this and it's wrong, but I think that their idea is to apply sort of an emergent biomimetic approach to AI. So rather than having one massive AI agent, to have sort of multiple smaller agents sort of collaborating together and have more emergent intelligence, like a school of fish. It's like sakana.
I see.
And I think that's the idea. So it's a very like philosophical approach, and it's very Japanese in its feel. So there is a lot that Japan can sort of offer the world, I think. And there's the thing is, I think this is sorry guys, this is my impression is that Japan tends to move slowly and then all at once and hugely in one direction. So watch out, everyone. That's I think I can see big things coming, especially in the very broadly in the field of AI. So I think it's Rapidus as well. There's another one that's a collaboration between multiple large organizations, and I think the government funded it with $4 billion USD.
Really?
Japanese
government?
Yeah, I think so. New chip fab. SoftBank's involved, I know, and a bunch of others. But a chip fab to compete with. Manufacturing microprocessors at a 2 nanometer scale. So the most advanced chip technology. So similar to TSMC in Taiwan. So one of the most important companies in the world, and. That's what they're aiming for. And even TSMC is now helping to build JASM. And in Kyushu, there are, I think, nearly 1,000 Taiwanese families have moved over into a small town in Kyushu to start working. There's a lot happening. So I'm very excited to be in some small way part of that. And I know he's coming over. He's got a snowboard, that's one thing. But he's also going to, share his wisdom. So, I'm very excited for things to come. Can't wait.
How about the private?
Oh, privately? Well, I feel like, Tokyo is kind of home now. So going back and settling in again. And then, just go back and forth, I think, here. And I also have my family in Australia and the UK who I love. So I'm going to go visit them every year as well, which is always very nice. I think just excited to double down and really apply everything I've learned and become a more sort of valuable and useful person.
What about for fun though? What are you doing for yourself?
This is fun, Neil. Okay. This is so much fun. I couldn't be doing anything more fun than this, honestly. Except maybe I'll ski, you can snowboard. I'm not a good snowboarder. Go find a village in Hokkaido somewhere. So how about you, Neil? What's your?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll start with professional.
You are almost on 1 year anniversary.
In California.
Yeah.
That's right. 1 year in California. I am now going to balance work with social. I have not been particularly social here.
I would disagree personally.
Oh yeah, because I socialize with the founders for sure, but they but they give me a hard time.
And you've got to go back to Chicago more. He loves his Chicago.
Oh, okay, I thought you were gonna say I love karaoke.
Oh, he loves karaoke.
But so I was actually gonna say that. So one of my professional goals is to be the bridge from San Francisco and the Bay Area to Chicago, because that's my home and where I'm from, but also to spend more time connecting to Tokyo as another place that I'm very passionate about, love spending time in, and would like to spend more time. And now that we have a TechStars connection and we have a community connection, and then there's a number of personal connections, I'm really excited about being the node that can bring those opportunities together, professionally and otherwise, but especially professionally. I'm really fascinated by cities all over the world and all the markets we operate in at TechStars, and what more value we can find by collaborating more. So this conversation is like a hint at that, right? Because it's not just TechStars Tokyo and TechStars Chicago and TechStars San Francisco, but there's also, we have a program in Australia,
in Sydney.
We have a program in London. Yeah. We have a program in all these places that we all care about and are connected to and want to go visit and see. So look at us bringing the world together, right, through these conversations. So I'm really proud about that. Yeah, one knot at a time. I got you. And then lastly, you said personal, right? So personal, I would say I am very excited to make more friends here. I think I took that for granted living in Chicago. The being there my whole life, I had so many connections, I still do. And now being in San Francisco, I have a lot of work to do, and it's a new challenge that I've never really had in my life, of getting to know people and being able to, I love cooking people dinner, and I love going out on, rides and adventures sometimes. And I haven't done nearly enough of that as I'm used to. And it's on me. to figure that out and to balance that with the default option, which is very easy, which is just spend time with all of my CEOs. So I have to balance my desire to make business progress with a need for the social component of one's personal life to be invested in as well. So that's my goal. So thank you for asking.
I love you mentioned investment is not only equal finance, like investment for our education, investment for time with family or like making friends. So everything investment. I love this is. And also, so for my next milestone is, so today finally like 100th anniversary. So I'm happy. And then now I got, so actually in funny things, every week I'm getting message from a stranger from Japan, like who company who may want to come to Silicon Valley, right?
Well, if I may, I was going to say you're starting to already accomplish that. So we had a conversation about planning this conversation, and then Kaori said, well, I organized an event. It's nearby. Do you want to go? And I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to. But then I went, and I met a lot of really valuable people, and we connected with 500 startups, and we made more.
Lucky and Jeff.
We made
Awesome.
you know. So I met some of them last week,
so
and so here you are making these opportunities and these connections. So I think that's really valuable. I think more people should consider being those bridges, because eventually it could lead to new work opportunities. You could find a company you really like and maybe work for them, or you can just keep helping people like us share what we do, and eventually that's going to be worth something and really valuable. So I'm really grateful that you brought us here to have this conversation. It means a lot, especially for your 100th episode.
I see. Thank you. It's kind of a conclusion. Yeah, so okay, my resolution, I want to do is one, for studying my podcast / community, and then so this year, like spring, I did many like monthly event in Tokyo to invite like founders and also investors. So I want to do it again here, and then so I come from Japan. We don't have storytelling education. So American people, they are good at like show and tell, right? Even super little kids.
Okay.
This is my hamster from my grandma, like that, right?
Oh, I guess so. Are we good at storytelling, George? You tell me.
Well, yeah, that's probably this country's greatest difference from Japan in terms of presentation. Tends to be very, here are the 3 key takeaways, make you feel something. Japan, it tends to be more, here's my 100 points of information on one slide. Lots of information. It's a very high context culture, right? I mean, even kanji itself is very, very information dense, whereas English, and particular American English, is very like straight to the point, as simple as possible, because it's more efficient in a way. So I understand that culture, but again, the UK is not like that really. So I've had to adjust my communication style quite a lot. I'm still trying, but I have more of an English way of speaking, and it tends to be very more like Japanese, very around the point, too polite sometimes. And here, people kind of tune out. They're used to hearing directly, what are you trying to say? Tell me right away. Just be direct. 3 words, not 20. And again, Japan, I think, can be a bit that way too. So it has its value, but it's just very different.
Thank you. So that, I want to do something like even tiny event to maybe like a practicing pitch. Yeah, someone can get feedback. I want to try practicing pitch and then like learning something successful formula of a pitch too, right? And then like a strong word, super precisely strong word. It makes us kind of a confidence and also making trust. We often talk about trust and then making our brand, right? So I want to learn and practice. This is my next goal.
Good.
Yes.
Very good.
Okay, thank you so much for attending our 100th anniversary episode, Neal and George.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kawari. おめでとうございます。
Okay, maybe next year we can eat ramen in Tokyo.
Yes, ramen. Yes.
Vegan ramen.
Yay. Okay, bye bye. The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Neal and George, part 2. Takeaway 1. Why investing in people matters most. As highlighted, people are everything. A business may evolve its product, customers, or strategy, but it's the people, especially the leadership, who drive long-term success. Great leaders inspire, align their team, and adapt to challenges, ensuring that the company's vision stays strong as it scales. Key takeaway 2. How TechStars empowers startups to succeed. TechStars offers 30 programs globally. Its unique flavor of expertise and mentorship. Founders can choose a program that aligns with their goal, from San Francisco's focus on AI and SaaS to Tokyo's unique ecosystem. The give-first mindset and cross-program collaboration help startups build their networks, gain mentorship, and accelerate their growth, just as George shared from his own transformative experience. Key takeaway 3. Founders' mindset and community are key to goal growth. Building a community is essential for founders, and George and Neal emphasized the power of connection. Neal is focused on creating relationships and bridging communities between San Francisco, Chicago, and Tokyo. And me, fostering my own network in San Francisco while supporting others in their journeys. George also values being surrounded by like-minded founders, showing how the right environment and mindset can fuel personal and professional growth. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope our story will help your future and career. So please subscribe our podcast and like it. バイバイ。またね。